Our story begins at the Santa Barbara Cemetery, where so many other stories end. Here lies Charles Albert Storke, former legislator, mayor, and district attorney, and his son, Thomas More Storke, the longtime editor and publisher of the Santa Barbara News Press, someone I was eager to know more about, having spent much of my life in the newspaper world. But you can't talk about Tom Storke without first talking about his father, Charles Albert Storke. Born in 1847 in New York, he was the very first student at Cornell University. Earned his tuition as a printer and a proofreader and got ink in his veins early on. But he became a teacher after he graduated in Brooklyn and came to Santa Barbara in 1872. He was recruited to be a teacher at the Santa Barbara College. It really was a high school and an elementary school, but it was called the Santa Barbara College. It was located across from what's now the museum on the corner of State and Anapamu. Storke taught there for only a year, but he managed to marry one of his students during that time. Maddie Moore was a daughter of a prominent rancher from Goleta and a descendant of the Ortega family. He married into Santa Barbara history. He did have ink in his veins, but Santa Barbara already had a newspaper, started in 1868, the Santa Barbara Post. So he went a little farther south to another sleepy town and created the Los Angeles Herald. It washed out within a year in the Panic of 1873, although the paper would live on and later become a part of the Hearst Empire, known as the Los Angeles Herald Examiner. He returned to Santa Barbara, studied law, and became a prominent member of the bar. This is an etching from about that time, and you'll see the city has begun to grow a little bit with the completion of Stearns Wharf in 1872. Came aboard a steamship and then came to land at the Chapala Wharf, the shorter wharf you see there, but noted in his diary that Stearns Wharf was just being completed at the time, and it had been by the time he came back, and really opened Santa Barbara up to the world. With the fee from his very first case, he bought 123 acres of land that nobody else wanted, up on the hillside above the mission. There were only 2 houses up there, which are tiny little specks, but you can see them if you look closely in that drawing. And he lived in one of them at what is now 1740 Grand Avenue. And then in 1876, Thomas More Storke arrived. 1876 was a big year, and not only because Thomas More Storke arrived. It was the centennial of the United States. It was only 11 years after the Civil War had ended. In Santa Barbara, only 30 years after the Spanish era, and Spanish was still pretty much the official language in Santa Barbara at that time. Storke grew up speaking Spanish and English. Also in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and 2 years later, Thomas Edison invented electric lights. In 1887, the first train arrived from Los Angeles, and young Tommy Storke was there. He was 11 years old. By the time he was 16 and a junior at Santa Barbara High School, his father decided he'd learned all he could learn there, and it was time to go on to college. And as it happened, his father had tutored the first president of Stanford University, which was then a new university. And so when he was 16 years old, Storke became a student at Stanford. The head of his dormitory, Herbert Hoover. He graduated in 1898 and came back to Santa Barbara, which by then was a bustling Western town. He was a little bit at loose ends about what he should do with himself, and so for a while he herded sheep at his uncle's ranch out on Santa Rosa Island. But it became pretty clear that that wasn't his purpose in life, and so when he was back on the mainland, he got himself a job at the Morning Press. By then, there were 3 newspapers in Santa Barbara. He was making $6 a week as a cub reporter. but he had found his calling. And encouraged by his father, he began to feel the itch to have his own newspaper. And so he bought the third and by far the weakest of the newspapers in Santa Barbara, the Independent. On January 1st of 1901, the first day of the new century, he published his first issue. And there they are, he and his staff standing in front of the Independent building, which was on Ortega Street, just near where Dargan's Pub stands today. And standing in the doorway there with a suit on, third from the right, that's young Thomas Storke. They moved over to State Street soon after that, the 800 block of State Street, and were able to upgrade their equipment. There's Tom standing by the furnace over on the right-hand side. At 24, he was on his way. And then he made a mistake. In 1909, somebody made him an offer too good to refuse, offered him far more than his newspaper was worth, and he took it. Decided to go into the oil business. And so he moved across the mountains and out to Kern County, and very quickly realized his mistake. He had promised the person who bought his newspaper that he wouldn't compete with him. And technically he didn't. But in 1913, he bought the competing newspaper, the Daily News, in the name of his father, who became the editor and publisher. The old man, he called himself, and that's how he signed his editorials. Soon after that, he managed to put the Independent out of business and managed to buy it as well and combine, if you look closely at the top, it's the Daily News and Independent. That was the newspaper in Santa Barbara, one of them, for the next 20 years. And then in 1932, he bought the Morning Press and for 5 years ran it as a separate paper. And then finally in 1937, merged it into the paper that we know, the News Press. In that same year, he also put the first radio station in Santa Barbara on the air, KTMS. Familiar initials, Thomas More Storke. And as a result, he played a role in every major event in Santa Barbara in the early 20th century. In 1901, he was dispatched by the Chamber of Commerce to Los Angeles to see Milo Potter, who happened to be a friend of his, asking him to open a grand hotel in Santa Barbara that might compete with the Hotel del Coronado in San Diego and the Del Monte in Monterey. It really was a grand affair with extensive gardens. It had its own farm where they grew the vegetables that it served in the hotel. It had a polo field and a golf course out in what's now Hope Ranch. And it had sidings off the train station where people could come from the Midwest and the East in their private Pullman cars and park them and stay a month or two. In 1913, the Flying A Studios opened in Santa Barbara. It stayed in Mission, bringing the silent film industry here before Hollywood had been thought about. In 1914, a brand new post office was built at the corner of State and Anapamu, across from the school. And lo and behold, Tom Storke himself was the first postmaster to occupy that building. By 1921, the Potter Hotel had become the Ambassador, and it went up in a great flame. Really, the Potter had outlived itself almost by the time it opened. And certainly by the 1920s, nobody was coming in private Pullman cars to Santa Barbara anymore to stay a month or two. They were driving in their own automobiles. After the Ambassador burned, the headline says, "A new hotel is sure to rise from the ashes." But it didn't happen. And so Tom Storke and a banker friend each put up $5,000 to buy an option on that huge space between Chapala and Bath Streets on the waterfront until the bonds could be approved to purchase it as a city park. Unfortunately, the competing newspaper came out against that proposal, saying that Storke was just trying to enrich himself, and it was voted down. And so rather than a 2-block park along the waterfront. We have the motel district instead. The 20s, the cultural 20s they were in Santa Barbara. Storke says they were perhaps the most significant decade in the whole century. And in 1922, what he called an event that radically changed the destiny of the city took place when the Community Arts Association combined into its three divisions with art and music and drama. And then in 22, the all-important fourth division was added, the Plans and Planting Committee, which would have much to say and do with architecture and landscaping in Santa Barbara. And then in 1924, the Libero and the Granada opened, and a new city hall was dedicated. Also in 1924, the first fiesta was held, with Dwight Murphy himself as Presidente riding on one of his palominos. And then disaster. The earthquake struck on June 29, 1925. It destroyed much of downtown Santa Barbara, especially the new buildings that had been built of something other than adobe and tile. People soon came to realize, as Storke said, that this was a blessing in disguise. And so soon a new board was created, the Architectural Board of Review, to review proposals to build new buildings in town and insist that they be built in the Spanish style. There was also a plan to widen State Street and an approval that everything would be done to make Santa Barbara rebuild in a distinctive style. And now you might just notice on the left-hand side, the smaller headline, what was going on in the rest of the country. The Scopes trial was on. In 1928, oil was discovered at Elwood. The superintendent of the oil well called Storke up early one morning and said it was about to happen. And so he picked him up and took him out to Goleta to watch the well come in. In 1929, the new $2 million courthouse was opened, a public building unique in all America. Thousands thronged the building. In 1937, a new post office was dedicated in Santa Barbara, and that's a whole nother story in itself and a fascinating one. The post office had outgrown its grand building at the corner of State and Anapamu, and so the postal authorities decided the thing to do was to build an addition on the back of it, which Storke dismissed as a three-story shoe factory. So he went back to Washington to straighten things out and pointed out that something like that might be okay in any other town, but not in Santa Barbara, which had really fashioned itself by then into a very special architectural town. So Storke convinced them that alone among all the post offices in the United States, all of which were designed by post office architects, Santa Barbara should have its own. And after the meeting, from the parking lot, called up on a payphone Reginald Johnson, who had already designed the Biltmore Hotel and a number of fine homes in Santa Barbara and Montecito, and persuaded him that he should design the new building for free. And Johnson agreed. And it is really a magnificent building. That gets at the special role that Storke managed to play during the New Deal. He had been a part of the California delegation to the Democratic National Convention in 1932 when Franklin D. Roosevelt was nominated. And he worked his sources and his friends and his acquaintances in the new administration and brought lots and lots and lots of bacon home to Santa Barbara during the New Deal. And in 1939, he persuaded the government that they should give the old post office to Santa Barbara as a new museum of art. In 1940, Storke persuaded the government to put Santa Barbara on the list for a new airport, even though it didn't have the required minimum population. It was now or never, you'll see Storke thundered in a front page editorial on the left-hand side. And the next year, in 1941, the bonds were approved. In 1948, a new university was sought out in Goleta. It would be where the Marine base had been during World War II. In 1954, the new University of California at Santa Barbara opened. Storke called it the most beautiful college campus in the world. In 1955, at nearly 80, he became a regent of the university system. and soon his fellow regents would build Storke Tower and name it in his honor. In 1958, Lake Cachuma spills, and this was one of Storke's biggest projects, a full front page photo the day the lake spilled. People had said it would never happen, but indeed it did. There was a second front page with an editorial on it where Storke calls it the most significant local story of this century, and two more pages inside with more photographs and stories. Storke was not shy about taking credit. In that front page editorial, he says, "The publisher of the news press provided the political knowledge and personal contacts that finally won approval in Congress. It took the experience of 50 years in active state and national politics on the part of the news press publisher to provide the know-how to deal successfully with the state and federal bureaucracy." Also in 1958, Storke wrote his biography. It's a wonderful book, especially for a newcomer interested in Santa Barbara histories, full of insider stories about the people and the places of this special town. I will say that Storke perhaps was a better publisher than writer, but he got help from his collaborator, Walker Tompkins, who was quite a well-known columnist and wrote a number of books of his own. Some people say he got quite a lot of help from Tompkins, and in fact, some of the stories that are in this book do appear in some of Tompkins' other books. He had friends in high places. There's his friend, the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, writing the foreword to the book. He got very good reviews, especially in his own newspaper. Here's a story from April of 1959. Listen to this quote. His publisher says, "In all my 30 years as a book publisher, I have never seen a title which received so many favorable reviews. I doubt if Gone with the Wind got any more attention." Well, as Churchill allegedly said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it myself." And that was Storke's approach. I only want to quibble with a couple of sentences in the book. This one, he claims, "Through it all, I have been a newspaper man and not a politician." Well, he was a newspaper man all of his life. That part's true. But he was quite a politician as well. After all, he was postmaster from 1914 to 1920, the top federal man in Santa Barbara. He was a delegate to the Democratic Convention throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. He was in the room when FDR was chosen as the nominee in 1932. In fact, he played a key role in shifting the California delegation to FDR's side. And then he says, "Remembering I was a newspaper man, I went out to call the paper and get the news in the next day's edition." He was United States Senator, no less, only for 6 weeks in 1938, after the junior senator resigned a little bit early. Congress wasn't even in session, but Storke went back to Washington nonetheless and started working the levers of power and calling in favors and bringing home the bacon once again. And for the rest of his life, he was known as Senator Storke. Throughout his life, he pulled strings and asked for favors and cultivated friends in high places. The second thing I want to quibble with is his role in the creation of Santa Barbara as a Spanish town. He says everyone in Santa Barbara cooperated sooner or later, and he might have been talking about himself when he wrote that. He says in his book that he was enthusiastically in favor, a big supporter of all that happened in creating Santa Barbara's Spanish flavor. But other books tell a slightly different story. In another of Walter Tompkins' books, published after Storke had died, he says that, in fact, Storke was opposed to the government telling people what kind of buildings they should build, and that it was only when the idea caught on that he switched sides. And in our own Sheila Lodge's book, she quotes Tompkins as saying that Storke believed that it was an infringement on personal rights, if not a communistic idea. Interestingly, there's only one paragraph in the book about the courthouse, but it's a pretty good one. He says that it's unquestionably the most beautiful civic building in California, if not in all of America. And we do have to give him credit. He did hire George Washington Smith to design his corporate headquarters and threw away plans that he had already had drafted to build it in a more conventional style. In the book, he makes much of his son Charles becoming his successor at the news press. Storke had 4 children with 2 wives, and his son Charles Albert Storke II worked closely with his father for decades at the newspaper. He was co-editor and co-publisher for years. But as he neared his 50th birthday and the old man showed no hint of retiring, he finally gave up and abdicated to Mexico City in 1959, where he opened an advertising agency. So TM, as he was known for most of his life, TM resumed complete personal direction of the news press at 83. In 1961, he took on the John Birch Society, outraged that they had accused Dwight Eisenhower, no less, of being a communist, and especially that they wanted to impeach his friend Earl Warren. As a result, in 1962, he won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing. Actually, he didn't write the editorials, but he was the editor, and so he was happy to accept the prize. And he wrote another book to tell the story and repeat some of his earlier stories as well. And you'll notice, if you can see in the small type up at the top of the page, the foreword in this one was written by no less than Adlai Stevenson. Time magazine the next year called Tom Storke a benevolent tyrant who's played king of Santa Barbara for 61 years. In 1964, at age 85, he finally faced up to reality and decided to sell the newspaper. He still hadn't reconciled with his son, so he sold it to the owner of the Philadelphia Bulletin, interestingly enough, who was a friend that he had known through the Associated Press. A part of the deal was that Storke would remain as editor and publisher emeritus for as long as he wanted to. But it just wasn't the same. Tompkins writes that he was paid an honorarium of $1,000 a week for life, but TM fretted in the lonely vacuum of unwanted retirement in his 3rd-story executive suite in the News Press Tower. But county supervisors and city mayors no longer came hat in hand to his office seeking advice or political favors. Shorn of the power of the press, Tom Storke found himself reduced to the status of just another citizen. He died on October 12, 1971, 6 weeks shy of his 95th birthday, at home, in bed, at 1716 Santa Barbara Street. He was buried in the cemetery beside his father, the old man, and honored at a public memorial service at the Old Mission. He was eulogized by his old friend, the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who called him the most powerful citizen of this century in Santa Barbara. Thank you very much. A little bit of an epilogue just to bring the story up to now. In 1984, the newspaper was sold to the New York Times and continued to be a very good small-town newspaper. In 2000, it was sold to Wendy McCaw for $110 million, and there was some celebrating that was back under local ownership again. But that would be the beginning of a period of a long, slow, self-inflicted strangulation. And last year, the news press declared bankruptcy.